Caitlin Clark's record-breaking season in NCAA Division I basketball and her subsequent #1 WNBA draft pick status has resulted in unprecedented attention to women's basketball in general and the WNBA in particular. However, much of the coverage from mainstream sports outlets is negative and undeniably characterized by misogynoir, defined by Letitia Brown, one of our panelists today, as the specific form of anti-Black misogyny experienced by Black women in social and digital spaces. The WNBA is a uniquely diverse sporting space, with 70% of the players being Black women. Black women sports journalists have called out mainstream coverage, and WNBA players and coaches have spoken up to object to being framed according to racist and sexist tropes. But I don't know that anyone has fully explored the anxiety underlying mainstream coverage of the WNBA. Today, we will hear from 3 scholars who are uniquely qualified to understand the current moment because they have been studying the WNBA for decades. Dr. Letitia Brown is an assistant professor of sociology and an affiliate of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at the University of Cincinnati, where she teaches courses on social inequality and race and racism. A Black feminist sociologist, Dr. Brown's scholarship centers the lived realities of Black women and girls with respect to sports, media, culture, education, and girlhood. Her areas of expertise include the sociology of sport, gender, race and racism, sexuality, culture, and qualitative methods. Her public scholarship can be found at First and Penn. Dr. Judy Liao is an associate professor at Augustana in the social sciences at the University of Alberta. Dr. Liao has been an avid fan of the WNBA, Go Seattle Storm, since its inauguration in 1997. Dr. Liao has published scholarly materials examining media representations of the league from the 2000s, the early 2010s, when internationalization became the main focus, and how the politics of the WNBA entered mainstream discourses in the late 2010s. Dr. Tiffany Muller-Myrtle is senior lecturer in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University. Dr. Muller-Myrtle's current research examines urban inequalities and inclusion strategies, especially those targeting women and 2S LGBTQ+ communities. But her dissertation research, completed in 2007, resulted in the publication of 5 journal articles and a book chapter related to the WNBA, including Lesbian Community in WNBA Spaces and Liberty for All, Contested Spaces of Women's Basketball. I'm going to start by asking a question of each panelist. Dr. Brown, let me begin by asking you, how would you describe misogynoir with respect to its impact on sport and society?
Thank you for that question, Travers. The term misogynoir, coined by Moya Bailey, really explains that what happens to Black women in public spaces doesn't happen to them just because they're a woman of color. It's specific towards Black women, and it's based in anti-Black violence and misogyny, which is what, combines the term misogynoir. And it has to do with the ways that anti-Blackness and misogyny combine to malign Black women in our world. We're seeing it with pretty much the villainization of Angel Reese. We saw it during the 2020-21 Olympic Games with Simone Biles, when everyone was up in arms about her sitting down, because when Black women aren't operating the way the world expects us to, then we're problematized. But even when we're doing what the world expects us to do, we're still the problem. And when I see narratives about Angel Reese being the villain, and how the sport itself, the WNBA, that's dominated by women of color and Black women, is being said to now be targeting Caitlin Clark, and we have to protect her at all costs from these vicious women that are older than her because they're jealous. And it's like, do you hear yourself? Like, would this be the same narrative if the WNBA wasn't a predominantly Black space? I really don't think it would.
Thank you. Dr. Liao, my question for you. Based on your long-term observation of the WNBA, is this Caitlin Clark phenomenon unique? And if so, how so?
Thank you, Travis. So I want to kind of think through this question on like three layer. First, the super rookie that changing the WNBA this kind of narrative. This is definitely not news. Like from even the earliest era, like Shamika Hoskwa, after her being picked in 1999, and she became the first athlete to be on Slam magazine cover. And that same narrative, this women's gonna change the WNBA. And from then on, you can see a lot of super rookie like Suber, Dana Taurasi, Maya Moore, Stewie. They all UConn because I'm a UConn fan. I'm sorry. Uh, so the discourse of this new player coming to change or save the WNBA are it's really deeply rooted. Consider WNBA is always in an inferior league, right? It's always needs someone come out of NCAA to save it. So and the second, I was kind of think about the sense of change and saving sometimes become even more intensified when the rookie's white, of course. Now we see it again in Caitlin Clark. But again, this is also not new. This white savior tendency in the WNBA and Super Rookie. We can see a couple of years ago, Sabrina Ionescu, Kelsey Plums. And so they, or even as Suber at that time, Suber, and there, because I'll argue because this white women image is easier than to be heterosexualized, right? So in the Super's era, she went on the red carpets with Nick Carter, and there's all of a sudden a rumor coming out they're dating. And all of a sudden, WNBA was able to get into mainstream conscious because these white women are easily being heterosexualized. Same thing as Sabrina Ionescu, right? When in her rookie year, just right after she got picked, she went on. She was interviewed by Glam magazine, and the title is "Sabrina Ionescu going to change a women's basketball. She hasn't even played pro yet." I'm like, seriously, this is like that kind of coverage you easily see when this super rookie is white woman. Oh, I should also say, I'm not saying those super rookie are not great; they're all spectacular. But you just kind of see that kind of positioning behind. I think the third relationship is not a whole lot of people talking about. This is actually the key thing I've been thinking about. I think will be really my focus for this panel is the relationship between NCAA and WNBA. And this super rookie phenomenon, I think traditionally is because NCAA is always bigger than WNBA, right? Because the entity itself is much more mainstream and commercialized. So when they make big in NCAA, people are thinking, okay, we know this person way better than everyone in WNBA, so they must be better. But we also see a tendency in the past is after they come into WNBA, their starter just gone because not a lot of people pay attention to WNBA. And this, I will say, is because the level of commercialization is very different. Right? The commercial interest around NCAA, not even though not the player individually, they cannot get any profit, but for the program, for the whole league, is a huge commercial enterprise. But WNBA is not. So I remember I can't remember her name, but one of the star player in WNBA a couple of years ago, they put a social media post basically asking, where is my NCAA fans and media coverage? Right? So they are the star there, but all of a sudden they've gone. But I think one of the reasons why Caitlin Clark can still maintain her stardom is because the name, image, likeness right now is available for NCAA players. So she is the first generation actually prove herself as Caitlin Clark is the individual, not just an NCAA player, can be profitable. So the money and the interest follow her. That's why she is kind of somehow bringing the WNBA into the mainstream media conscious, right? But the problem is because it is the Caitlin Clark individual bringing WNBA into media focus. The WNBA is framed through Caitlin Clark, this player, not the WNBA as a whole, right? So that's why, of course, Angel Reese is going to be framed as a villain because she is another player play against her as pretty much at an equal footing, but it's not allowed in the Caitlin Clark world. And it's worse, it's Angel Reese is for black women. So, and all the veterans, same thing, right? They're saying they're somehow targeting her. But again, it's not a new thing. If you're a good player coming into the league, people are gonna test you.
Yes.
But right now, looking from the Caitlin Clark frame, this is a bad thing. So I
Thank
think
you.
I'll leave it there. I'm thinking about the commercialization right now, this piece.
I know you've added a really important piece here that the change to policy on name, image, and likeness, which now allows NCAA athletes to actually profit from their celebrity status. This is quite a recent policy, so that's a really interesting point to raise. Thank you, Dr. Muller-Myrtle. My question for you. You finished your dissertation and published articles on the WNBA in 2007, a long time ago. What strikes you about the level of discourse now?
Thanks for that question, Travers, and it's wonderful to be here with very current scholars in this area. I, you know, taking a historical view, it's not that different, quite honestly. I was really interested at the time that I was doing my field work, which is, 2004 through 2000, sort of finishing up, last probably interviews in early 2007. So we're talking about ancient times, 20 years ago. And I was very interested in the ways that the league, could not turn away any fans, but also had this very uneasy embrace of the lesbians, both fans and players. And there was some, media attention to the sexuality, super rare, but I was revisiting my pack rat tendencies and found an old article about Latasha Byers from early 2000s, and the coverage, we're talking about a couple of articles in the LA Times. Latasha Byers was a player for the LA Sparks and was a butch Black woman. She was accused of rape, I believe, and the discussion in that article was about the difference in treatment of her as compared to Kobe Bryant. And, essentially Byers had a terrible treatment, as I guess I would expect for Black women, Black lesbians who are not femme presenting, all of the things. So there are, the league has, I find it super interesting, and I'd love to hear from the other panelists on their view on this. But at the moment that I was doing my work, there was minimal attention and discomfort around sexuality and willingness to embrace, talk about gay players in the league, lesbian fans. I think that is one element that has changed. There's been some movement there. But I think this long-held fear, homophobia, misogyny, deep attachment to the gender binary, that hasn't moved that much. Yeah, I guess I can add more as we go.
And that's a really interesting dynamic to explore, when you compare the culture and the media presence of the NCAA versus the WNBA. So that's something to pick up on, a little later on. But that's a really interesting dynamic that you're observing. I'm going to throw out to all three of you this question. Agree or disagree? The WNBA ecosphere represents somewhat of an alternative reality or an alternate reality or parallel world, one where Black women, queer, and gender nonconforming people experience greater respect and acceptance. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I guess I'll jump in. And I think this is a great question right after what Tiffany kind of give us a little bit of the ground. Let us see the earlier WNBA, right? Like the early 2000s. So when I get this question, I'm thinking about it. I will say for the past while, yes, kind of. And because gonna go back to history a little bit. I think there is a reason for why they're able to somehow cultivate this space. Partially is because WNBA is failing in marketing to the general public, which is a good thing. It's actually in like turned out right. Because in the beginning, the time Tiffany was doing her work and observing is the time of WNBA just when the WNBA just started, actually in the 1997, 98, they play in a packed stadium. They broadcast like widely, even internationally. That's one of the reasons why I became a fan, even when I was not in North America. Okay, so but after a couple of years, the fame and the popularity kind of died down. Partially because they were so popular before. It was because the Olympic hype, where we get a goal, we're so good, and all the American women finally get to come back home. So those American exceptionalist narrative is really helping the early WNBA fame. Then when they start realize, okay, there's a bunch of strong, muscular women playing this ridiculous sport, and the league trying to save it. So you can kind of see the early promotion of the league. A lot of scholars have been writing on that. It's super conventional and heteronormative kind of white narrative, right? So you see the very, I think super right now, if she see that promotional video, she must be embarrassing. It's the 2003, This Is Who I Am. They all dress pretty and just like, I'm I'm a daughter or whatever. That's kind of image they're trying to promote because they're trying to say, no, they're not just muscular women, they're also pretty women. But it still fail because you might be able to attract people, say, oh, Super is really cute, let's go watch her play. And they're like, oh my God, she's aggressive. So this, in a way, that's what I mean by failing marketing, right? So I think the WNBA in the end is just like, we give up. We're just gonna, so you can kind of see a slogan in later, close to 2010, probably start to see, watch me work, expect excellence. They really started to move away from that impossible image anyway, move to athleticism in a way that allowed the player to kind of just express whatever. So it's kind of WNBA somehow become this liminal queer space, not necessarily sexuality wise. It's because no one actually care about if they're pretty or not anymore because it's not going to work. I think it's unintentionally that create that space. And we have most of WNBA player. This is one point I kind of keep trying to talk to my friends to see if that makes sense. WNBA's eligibility requirement is very high, 22-year-old or finished college education. They actually force players to have different social exposure. So those players coming in, someone who kind of see a little bit more and they get a freedom to express and experiment, I think that somehow make WNBA this alternative reality.
Thank you.
By accident, I will say.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Letitia, do you have thoughts on that?
I do. And thank you, Judy, for your discussion and explanation. I think you made a lot of really great points. And to answer your question, Travers, agree or disagree, I would have to say in this instance, it's one of those both and situations because the WNBA exists within our larger social world. It's still, marred by the same social issues. And especially thinking about Blackness and womanhood and the ways in which Black women are never really read as soft. Black children don't really have the experience of being children. Black people are always kind of criminalized because we wear our weapon on our bodies. It's our skin. And we cannot change that. I know that as a person who's 5'2" and brown skin, I'm still read as a threat. And I'm still read as aggressive if I speak my mind or say things. And so when we have WNBA players 6 feet and above, there is this kind of like social constructed narrative that they are more violent and terrifying. But what I think is interesting that's happening right now with the WNBA is the ways that they're getting so connected to the fashion world in ways that we've never seen before. So we have basketball players at the Met Gala. We have them walking runways. We've always seen like NBA players at these high fashion events, but now we're starting to see the women of the WNBA. And of course, I think that that has positive and negative, impacts in both ways because no space is perfect and without issues. But I do think it's going to be fascinating to watch because the idea of heterosexism is so strong and powerful that we're still trying to find ways to soften, quote unquote, women in these types of spaces. So I think it's going to be a really interesting kind of moment.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Tiffany?
Yeah, this is a great question. And just picking up on Letitia's point about fashion, I had to, again, digging in, I'm like such a pack rat. In the old dissertation box, I found some articles from the WNBA website, probably 2003, 4, that focused on fashion because one of the instructors I had in graduate school was Mary Jo Kane, who was a sport media scholar. And I remember, her catchphrase at that time was the way that women athletes were depicted out of uniform, off the court, and in sexualized poses. And that was, of course, part of the way in which I analyzed media sort of coverage of the WNBA, of specifically, I was looking at the Minnesota Lynx and to a certain extent the New York Liberty. So there was a conversation about fashion. There were things on the like a column on the WNBA website at the time. I have an example here. It was called Fashion with a Bounce. And, really showing what I perceived as like the quote unquote appropriate femininity, right? And the making more hetero visible. And so I went to the WNBA website to see if I could find this article, but what I found was the current WNBA latest fashion content. So I think, there's in some way anyway, I suspect that there has always been some element of trying to make players relatable. I imagine, as Letitia said, that happens in terms of like key events. But I don't know. I didn't look. Does the NBA also have a fashion side? I kind of doubt it. So I yeah, that piece about like appropriate femininity, and I would say white femininity, right? Like I understand that, or I was listening to some coverage with a sports admin scholar, Ajane Keaton. I hope I pronounced her name correctly. She did an interview with Dave Zirin and was talking about Angel Reese as a person who brings Black femininity to her presence, and was talking through the ways in which that's being picked up by Mercedes-Benz and other kinds of corporate entities that you maybe wouldn't expect. And they were talking through, I would point folks to that interview because she's the expert in that area. Anyway, I think those are interesting pieces to answer the question about an alternative space. That was kind of the point of my dissertation, was thinking about women's sports space, quote unquote, because I was doing a feminist geography PhD. I was really interested in the way also that there was a real incentive for professional sport organizations, specifically the NBA, to fill the arena during the summertime, during the off season, right? And there was this, moment of the 90s and early 2000s of like the bringing the tourist dollars back to the city, quote unquote, a bit of a creative city kind of attention. And it was a very different space than the NBA game. And partly, of course, it was about whether or not it was well attended. And I think the New York Liberty, in my experience, was a very different space than being at the Minnesota Lynx, which was think more historically underattended, at least for a time. But it was, really framed as like dads and daughters. And this like family friendly narrative. And, so much of the fan base were lesbian women, families and otherwise, right? So I found it to be an alternative space in certain senses, but I think, as Letitia said, it's definitely a both and, because the broader discourse around the acceptance or the ways in which the athletes were being reappropriated as appropriately feminine or straight also played a role in what that sports-based experience was like.
Yeah, and the WNBA in its early years was, very exemplary of the female apologetic. Yes, we're athletes, but we're still women, la la la, in terms of the stereotypical notions of femininity, and trying to distance themselves while benefiting from the dollars of the lesbian fan base, because you do not have successful WNBA teams without like a really big lesbian fan base, like, let's face it. But we've seen a little bit of a change, haven't we? I mean, I've been watching a lot of games lately, and you find out from the announcers that two players on the Connecticut team, Alyssa Thomas and Dawana Bonner, are engaged. They show a picture of Arike Ogunbowale's proposal to her partner. There are pictures of Jonquil Jones on after proposing marriage to her partner. You have people referring to their wives as if it's the most normal thing in the world. So we've seen a lot of change. We've also seen that Brittany Griner, who is very gender nonconforming and very, very tall, and got a lot of attention because she was detained in Russia under horrific conditions. Unfortunately, she came back. But there are places for the Brittany Griners, there, for the Teresa McCowans, the statuesque, stereotypically masculine Black women that there weren't in the same way about 20 years ago. So if I'm asking, any or all of you to speak on the change that we've seen and the limits to inclusion that you observe. Noting it's not accidental that Caitlin Clark is a white girl next door,
Yeah.
as Paige Beckers will be when, she gets drafted and plays in the WNBA. But yeah, sorry to cut you off.
No, you're definitely fine. I agree that there has been change. There isn't so much more of this like effort to focus solely on the WNBA players that are in heterosexual relationships, because that was a lot of like what the early 90s, 2000s did. And like I was still growing up, but I was like, that's okay. We're talking about the fact that they take care of their kids too. Awesome. What about basketball? Like we never really talk to men about if they're taking care of their kids, but that's a whole different kind of thing. And so while I think it's wonderful that there's more visibility, I think around, queer and lesbian participants of the WNBA, I still think it like moves around this kind of soft heterosexist narrative, because we're focusing on the normative things. Like getting married is a very normative thing to do in our society. And even though, gay marriage hasn't been around as long as it should have been, it's still something that we're seeing as more mainstream. And we're still kind of focusing on these like, well, how can we still position them that we read them as what we expect women to be? Which I find to be really ironic, as we're in this kind of battle for our lives once again over how we can control our own bodies as women. And yet we're still seeing like these narratives recreated and repurposed within like queer communities. Not to say like queer marriage is the same as heterosexual marriage, because I've never been married either way. I don't know. But I do think that it's just interesting that, especially when it comes to Caitlin Clark as like a white, straight woman, like there is a reason that she is becoming the center of the discourse, because that is the person that we expect to see in that position. And I'm curious as to what the other panelists think and what we're going to see in the future.
Yeah, you've commented on the extent of homonormativity. We're queer, but we're really just like you. I don't recall hearing about any WNBA player who has more than one partner, who's engaged in ethical polyamory, etc. I haven't heard that. I too would like to hear from the other panelists, though.
Judy, go ahead.
Yeah. I like Letitia articulated pretty clearly, right? So yes, we're still seeing the good queer, good black kind of narrative, even though yeah, they're muscular, but they're not threatening. They're just good athletes, right? Those muscle for the very productive reason. They're so I think that kind of narrative is definitely still around WNBA, and I think also one thing. Because people keep saying WNBA is so popular right now, and all that, we really forget one thing majority of player. So the latest version of collective bargain agreement. Yes, there are some to a degree progressive. They'll say they now can fly the charter and all that kind of things, and they have like really to a degree decent reproductive benefits and family benefits. But the prioritization. So we talk about Brittany Griner. One of the reasons she was detained because she had to play in Russia off season of WNBA, and that's still reality for most of the player right now, right? So even regardless how much attention Caitlin Clark get, majority of players still going to go overseas. And if you look around, Russia is not a place they can go right now. Probably likely not. Israel used to be one of the places they go to, likely not right now, right? So all that kind of things we don't talk about it anymore. I think when Diana Taurasi set out in 2015, I think I might be getting. We kind of talk about a little bit. Why even Diana Taurasi need to play out off season? When Brittany Griner got detained at first, we kind of talk about that a little bit. When the first collective agreement came out, we talk about prioritization a little bit, but then now we all talk about, Caitlin Clark, and Caitlin Clark. So. Yeah, and for the future, I guess I will comment that a little bit more later, I guess.
Thank you. Tiffany?
Yeah, I mean, I think I echo what has been said. It just, like always the good queer, right? The thing that is palatable. And, I would be interested in hearing what other folks have to say about like the need for a narrative, because I'm not a journalism expert, but I would suggest as a, critical reader that we don't need a narrative following men's sports. We follow the sports, right? Like what happens in the game. Um, and there is, I think on the women's side, it still seems like we have to have a narrative in mainstream media. And so it brings in all of the need for the, relationships and the whatever. I heard a podcast that my ears bled a little bit, where there was a, discussion about how, well, this stuff is really just demonstrating what women do anyway, right? They're just catty amongst themselves. I'm like, oh, okay, well, so that's where the level of the discourse has started and stayed. Yeah, and so I think we have a long way to go, and we're not talking about critical issues like pay equity. I understand that Aaliyah Edwards, who's a Canadian player, right, and now that she's been drafted, she can benefit from the name, image, likeness that she couldn't as a Canadian student on a international student visa. So, right, there is also that inequity for international students. So those are some things to think about.
I did not know that, but that's really interesting. This notion that in order to attract a fan base to women's sport, you have to have a story, and it has to be a compelling story, that is full of feeling and etc. Because some of the really inadequate literature relating to how to attract girls to sports. Girls are more social. They need to have belonging before they play, etc. Whereas, boys clearly don't. I mean, which, is so problematic, and we won't get into it. But what's really interesting is that I would argue that a very large percentage of the people who watch the WNBA also watch men's sports. And they do so without, being able to, see, I don't know, LeBron James often, bouncing his children on his knee. I think they're too big now. But, there's like his play stands for itself. The excitement of the competition stands for itself. Whereas, the idea that how are we going to sell women's sport? Because we can't sell it on the basis of the athleticism alone. Although, as I was saying to the panelists before we started, I watched the Commissioner's Cup last night, and the athleticism, and the coaching that was on display in that game was really, really exciting. I just like, I need no narrative, but it's interesting nonetheless. I want to shift a little bit to talk about the way in which the WNBA has been a base for really powerful social activism. It, starting in about like 2019, 2020, and I may be ignorant of prior organizing, but the WNBA has been a site of powerful political activism and social change initiatives. Does increased attention, courtesy of Caitlin Clark, hinder or help these efforts?
I could jump in there as a starting point, because the first example that came to my mind when you asked that question is the way that the Minnesota Lynx were fined in 2016, I believe, with by wearing Black Lives Matter t-shirts. And they were supported by the team and not by the WNBA. So there was this disparity between the sort of scales of governance. WNBA, as I understand, backed off and, rescinded the fining. But it was a super important moment to call out policing practice and racism. And, I have also been paid attention for a long time to this idea that it's sports, not politics discourse, which is like, are humans involved? Then it's political. So the question, does it help? I mean, I don't know. Like, as Judy talked about earlier, this is a long held sort of maybe peaks and valleys, like certain players move the needle for a minute. And maybe, I guess I don't feel like I have a definitive answer about that. More attention is better. I would like the attention to be good. Yeah.
Thank you. Letitia or Judy?
Yeah, I'm thinking about Caitlin Clark as an athlete and as a person. I do think that she's bringing more visibility and attention to the sport, but I don't think that she's raising awareness around issues that people like Maya Moore, Brittany Griner, Natasha Cloud have been doing for, years. Maya Moore left at the peak of her career in order to work on criminal justice reform and helped a person who was wrongfully incarcerated find their freedom again. We have Brittany Griner and others who've been rallying around trans rights and LGBTQ rights in general since forever. And Caitlin Clark's response has always kind of been like, I'm just here to play basketball, which is totally fine because we don't need or want everybody to be an activist. Like, that's not everybody's role. But I do think that it's easier to focus on Clark and her supposed rivalry with Angel Reese than it is to talk about these issues like gun violence, LGBTQ hate, transphobia, sexism, racism. Like, it's much easier and more palatable maybe to focus on, oh, they're just being mean to this girl. And it's like, but it's sports. That's what we do here. And it's not mean. It is the same amount of aggression that every person in that position would get, like has been said already today. When you're new, people are going to test you because they need to know.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I have worries about this Caitlin Clark moment and how that will impact WNBA's politicality, if that's a word. Because, like I said before, my theory is WNBA was able to become such a apologetic political entity as a collective, especially the player. The league, the league, I have no comment, but I am talking of the very strong intellectual collective, this player. It's partial because they're not super commercialized. They have that space. And this new generation of name, image, likeness player coming in, what I start to see, I don't know, maybe just because they haven't picked up any activism issue yet, is the newer generation of player really just like Letitia just say, we're just playing basketball. They refuse to engage any topic anymore, right? I think the last one, the first draft pick that talk about issues is Stewie, right? Sabrina just talking about women playing basketball. It's a very super white liberal narrative, right? Now we all play basketball. Yeah, so I have worry that if the WNBA lift to mainstream media or mainstream discourse, it's because Caitlin Clark's popularity, they're gonna restrict that kind of edge of the players and energy. So yeah, so I doubt her actually help WNBA's activism. I guess that's in short.
I like those of us who navigated queer spaces and women's spaces for decades are used to seeing like phenomenal women athletes, who are butch or femme, anything in between. It is an alternate reality, like, lesbian sports. I'm thinking of my own research on lesbian softball leagues. Like in a lot of ways, it's a different world. It's a different world. But I wonder, for many mainstream sports journalists, and I'm speaking mostly about men, all of a sudden they're looking at the WNBA and they're seeing these like phenomenal athletes of all shapes and sizes, majority Black women, and of all kinds of different bodies, etc., different gender presentations. Do you think we're seeing like white hetero panic from these guys?
Is there another answer than just yes?
No. Yeah, I mean, it certainly struck me. Like for me, like seeing the WNBA, going into an arena at a WNBA game, it's like I feel like, obviously there are limits, but these are my people. Like I feel comfortable here. Like I want to be in spaces where Black women are vocal and respected, and where gender nonconforming people and trans people are just fine. Those are the spaces that I feel most at home in. And I feel threatened, I have to say, by the mainstream attention. And especially, Judy, you brought up the issue of the NCAA being a much more commercially powerful, more mainstream space. We've seen, there was a lot of attention on Caitlin Clark in March Madness that translated. I mean, we've never seen the numbers watching the WNBA draft before. Selling out arenas, all this kinds of thing. And the WNBA has, been like very, very active in promoting Caitlin Clark so that they can maximize this attention. But I'm worried, like, and I guess what I'm not asking so much about the WNBA in terms of the leadership, but, as a community of athletes with lots of differences, but, some similarities, what can this community do to avoid, the hazards of mainstream attention? Like how can WNBA players as a community respond to the Caitlin Clark moment in a way that maintains the culture and values that have been established over the last few decades, which are, I would argue, somewhat transgressive. I mean, ask the woman who wanted to be the governor of Georgia how transgressive the WNBA can be, because they organized against her and she lost, which is one of the happiest political stories I have ever, watched in action. But what can the WNBA as a community do to address the Caitlin Clark moment in a way that doesn't water down some of the things that have been so hard fought for and so valued?
I don't have an answer to that. I just want to quickly jump in to correct myself because I misspoke saying the latest first pick that's speaking on any social issues. Stewie, that's my Yukon bias, is Asia Wilson. I'm sorry. Correction. Asia is younger than Stewie. So, but that itself, it's a tough question, and also partially because I don't feel I'm in a position to tell the players because I think they're super intelligent. They achieve a lot of things, and they also have, I think, Miss President still in the leadership, like Nega Gumake. They are super organized and strategic thinking. I Even though Trevor, I'm totally with you about the worry of the mainstream attention, but at the same time, look at their history. I also hoping and have a good degree of confidence the player will figure out a way that works for them as a collective and community. But yeah, but that's definitely something I can keep paying attention to see how player organize and how much their space will be restricted because of that, right? Because yeah, because everyone just say no.
Yeah, this will be particularly interesting to watch in the lead up to the 2016 election, or sorry, I'm still having traumatic flashbacks, the 2024 election. Indeed. Tiffany or Letitia, any comments?
Letitia, go ahead if you. I guess I would just say, I think it's a great question. I don't feel like I have a good answer, but the comment that comes to mind is that whatever, needs to happen collectively also needs to take into account the content we were talking about earlier in terms of players' own need to put themselves out there for sponsorship, right? Or to for their own salaries, to not have to play, travel abroad to play. And yeah, I think how that is a very difficult line to walk.
Absolutely. But a number of you have mentioned this, but what is being left out of mainstream discourse when you hear what sports writers or, I believe there was a congressman in the United States who was concerned about how Caitlin Clark was being treated, like people who normally don't talk about the WNBA at all. Like, what would you like to see mainstream discourse pick up on?
There's a comment in the chat that's kind of in the Q&A that I think speaks to this, and it says something about why is the mainstream media afraid to talk about the ways that whiteness and misogynoir are central to Clark's popularity and the protection of her? I think that we still have a lot of trouble naming whiteness as a foundational issue within our society. Nobody wants to talk about it, especially in this moment where we're challenging DEI and critical race theory, and people of color are more visible. And it's just the visibility doesn't undermine or undo white supremacist structures. So just because you're seeing Black people in these spaces doesn't mean that they have power to change those spaces. I think that misogynoir is being left out of the conversation. I think that the focus has really been on we're protecting this person from the violence of these older women, because it's always like these older women are bitter and angry. And it's like, but why? Caitlin Clark is a good player, but she is not a great player yet in the league. She just started. She's a rookie. And at this moment, she might not even be rookie of the year. So it's just like, Is it because these people are old and bitter, or is that just the way that you can characterize women, particularly when they're women of color and Black women specifically?
And you definitely hear progressive voices being silenced the minute that they identify whiteness as a factor. People aren't saying that Caitlin Clark isn't, a great basketball player. They're saying, like she's really exciting to watch. She's highly skilled, and it will be really exciting to see how she develops as an athlete in that league under that kind of pressure. She has not faced those, that kind of defense before. Like this is new for her, and her challenges as a defender are significant as well. But the second that you say that, her race is part of the reason why she's so appealing, then progressive voices are discounted. And I'm thinking of Jamel Hill, for example. She's experienced a lot of pushback on social media for calling it what it is.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, of course, and I think I want to also add on one thing. It's kind of tied to what Tiffany comments on the need for narrative, right? So we need to give a story. In that sense, we forgot that's the actual workplace. So the workplace equality and all that kind of, so like if we just stop thinking of WNBA as this nice story of everyone's happy, we see it's workplace, and then we can probably easily critique whiteness is there, sexism is there, heterosexism is there. But right now we want to paint it as a big story, and those things is not allowed in stories, I guess.
Absolutely. They want to control the narrative away from anti-Black racism and heterosexism, all those kinds of things. Absolutely. It's almost as if the WNBA is like allowed to occupy this liminal space, but it has to be contained. And I think that's what I've been noticing, how important it is to contain the threat, even though the threat is somewhat limited. I mean, you see Black women who are respected and in positions of leadership on their teams. One of the things that I found really exciting is the commentators, all Black women panels. It's been really exciting to see, but obviously that is very different than what we see in mainstream sports journalism. So no doubt. I promised that we would end this panel on time, so I'm going to start the wrap up. We've got about 8 minutes to go. This has been a really exciting conversation. What I'm going to ask each of the panelists to close on is like a little bit of a guidebook for those of us who are watching the WNBA who haven't been following it from a critical perspective for years. Some of us have, some of us haven't. Over the next year or two, what would you have us pay attention to? What would you have us monitor? What should we be looking for? I'll give you a minute to think about that. And then if you don't mind, I'll go in the order that we began. I'll ask Dr. Brown, can you draw things to our attention that we should be keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, I think some of the interesting things to watch in this next year is how the discourse shifts and if it shifts around Caitlin Clark. If there's an injury, if something, and also just kind of to pay attention critically to how her relationships are discussed in comparison to other players like Angel Reese. She was in a relationship and there was a whole lot of messy discourse around it in very different ways. And they talk about Caitlin Clark and her relationship. So I think that's going to be something to watch. I think that just the WNBA in general is going to be a space that is going to have a lot of attention, well-deserved attention, in my opinion. And hopefully it will last longer than these socially constructed narratives intended to tear down women when we could just, support them all.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Dr. Liao.
Yeah, I think I feel like I'm repeating myself. I really want us to pay attention to see what the WNBA as a league and the player as a collective start to lose space to voice about social and political issues, right? Stepping in this mainstream space, that is really one thing I'm really worried, and I'm going to pay close attention to, because I can't really remember this season any big social issue that has any WNBA player comments that it's in mainstream media, right? The past couple of years, they will say WNBA player or league say this, but now I don't remember I see anything.
Interesting. Thank you. Dr. Muller-Myrtle.
Yeah, I mean, I echo what the other panelists say, and I guess relying on my age, the I recall Women's Sports Foundation, some major sort of national scale organization in the US, um, some time ago, having a kind of media protocol. And I referenced the age because the player they used was Michael Jordan, right? They asked, would the person be asked this question if they were Michael Jordan, right? Would Michael Jordan be asked this question? Would Michael Jordan be pictured in these ways, represented in these ways, asked to depict themselves? And I guess that's, for me, what's the parallel? Are the WNBA players being asked to represent themselves, to speak to certain issues, to talk about sport or, their relationship in the same ways as NBA players? And is Caitlin Clark or, the more sort of media attention focused white player being asked the same questions as the Black women players, right? So I guess thinking about it through the lens of like comparison, what's the expectation? Maybe could be a useful guide. And I would also just think about sort of the historical thread. When the WNBA was launched, who was the face of the WNBA? Rebecca Lobo, right? Where Lisa Leslie, John Staley, they were the powerhouses. Rebecca Lobo was great, but she was the white player, right? This is a long-held problem in the WNBA, in women's sport in general.
Thank you. It makes me think, what if I organized this panel around the Angel Reese moment? What kind of different conversation might we have? And why are we not having that conversation? That's a really important corrective to think of. Like, who shapes the topics? It seems legitimate. I have to say, somewhat defensively, given that there is a lot of attention on Caitlin Clark. It is a phenomenon, but we haven't talked anywhere near enough about Angel Reese, and that is regrettable because she's an unbelievably exciting player to watch. She truly is. Like, anytime you have a chance to see Chicago play, you should, because she's a very exciting player, especially with Cardoso as they team up. But I'm getting jock, sport nerdy. That's fine. I want to thank each of the panelists for joining us for this conversation. It's very helpful to have perspective from spending a long time thinking about issues, because, as I said to you, everybody wants to talk about the WNBA, but I want to hear more from people who have been paying attention to it for a long time. And I think this has been very valuable to all of us.